Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence. Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence. Chapter 1. The Significance of the Rebirth Process. Gopi Krishna said that this mechanism known as Kundalini is the real cause of all genuine spiritual and psychic phenomena, the biological basis of evolution and development of personality, the secret origin of all esoteric and occult doctrines, the master key to the unsolved mystery of creation, the inexhaustible source of philosophy, art, and science, and the fountainhead of all religious faiths, past, present, and future. Over 40 years ago, in a seminar on Kundalini, C.G. Jung and his colleagues observed that the rising of this force had rarely, if ever, been seen in the West. They suggested that it would take 1,000 years for the Kundalini to be set in motion by depth analysis. However remote Jung considered the possibility of the rise of the Kundalini in his time, he certainly had a clear grasp of its psychological significance. He tells of a medieval monk who took a fantasy journey into a wild, unknown forest where he lost his way. On trying to return, he found his path barred by a fierce dragon. Jung says that this beast is the symbol of the Kundalini, the force that in psychological terms makes a person go on his or her greatest adventures. When the going gets rough, one then recants, "Oh damn, why did I ever try such a thing?" knowing that in turning back the spirit of divine adventure will go out of life and life will lose its flavor. Jung says, when you succeed in awakening the Kundalini so that it starts to move out of its mere potentiality, you necessarily start a world which is totally different from our world. It is a world of eternity. He goes on to refer to the Kundalini as an impersonal force. He says that if you claim it as your own creation, you do so at your peril. The price is ego inflation, false superiority, obnoxiousness, or madness. It is an autonomous process arising out of the unconscious that seems to use you as its vehicle. Although this rebirth process was rare in 1932 when Jung wrote of it, it now occurs regularly, with and without training, as is shown by the growing number of cases in the files of the Kundalini Research Foundation in New York and by our own increasing number of authenticated cases. There is now much greater interest in the subject in the West, as can be seen by the rapid expansion of all sorts of mind training, new therapies, meditative practices, and psychic pursuits. Thousands of people are now engaged in or interested in such activities. Even recently, the great increase in the use of hallucinogenic drugs can be seen as a determined, if dangerous and misguided, urge in the direction of things of the spirit. The marked increase in the number of individuals undergoing the rebirth transformation may be a reflection of a similar transformation taking place at a socio-cultural level in society as a whole. Jung pointed out that a time of dissociation such as prevailed during the Roman Empire and which prevails again in our own era is simultaneously an age of death and rebirth. When one principle reaches the height of its power, the counter-principle stirring within contains in its darkness the germ of a new light. Gopi Krishna says, there is a rebellion against the existing order because the brain has reached a state of development where the riddle of existence looms larger in front than it did before. This is the reason why millions of young men and women in Europe and America are eagerly on the search for masters and effective methods of self-awareness. At a certain critical state in the development of the human mind, the unanswered riddle of life attains an urgency which no treasure of the earth can counteract. This is the state of mind of millions of disillusioned young people of the world today. Modern psychology is absolutely dead to a most powerful impulse in the psychic makeup of man that has always been in evidence from the very dawn of civilization to this day. When thwarted in its mission, the impulse can lead to social and political unrest, craving for drugs, promiscuity, or other social evils, and even to violence. He then quotes an American physician, Dr. Treffert, director of a medical center in Wisconsin, who says, "About 30 Americans under 21 years of age commit suicide every day, indicating a threefold increase in the rate of suicide among American youth over the past decade. Also, more than half of the patients admitted to mental hospitals in the United States are young people. The main cause of the increase in the number of suicides and mental disorders among youth is the increasing hollowness and senselessness of life of the society and the younger generation's distaste for profit. Pressures arising from the underlying shift in society place a demand on religious leaders and consciousness researchers to provide environments and methods for the rapid and safe development of the inner potentials of the increasing number of seekers." Chapter 2. The Problem of Objectivity. In personal accounts of the rising of Kundalini, there is an endless array of emotions, strange thoughts, and visions, but descriptions of physical signs and symptoms or actual sensations are rare. Allusions to vague, subjectively perceived force fields and energy states are now common in descriptions of meditative experiences. Jung referred to the adherence to traditional models as a dogmatism that sprang from a long tradition of passing down principles from teacher to student. We see this commonly in the descriptions of Kundalini experience in yogic schools. While this is apparent from studying the Eastern writings, it is also true that in the West we have not clarified the different states of psyche and soma in accounts of transcendental experience. For example, William James, 1929, saw the great German mystic Suso as a suffering ascetic incapable of turning his torments into religious ecstasy. On the other hand, the Jung group thought Suso had experienced awakened Kundalini. These two views reflect the different interests that James and Jung brought to their study of Suso. James emphasized the ecstatic, and Jung was concerned with the relationship between individuation and Kundalini. However, Western science is now making objective laboratory measurements of changes accompanying spiritual phenomena, as well as encouraging more open and direct accounts of personal experience. Perhaps this has been the stimulus for the East to do likewise. Some recent accounts are rich with valuable information, and we can expect many more in the near future. Descriptions of this kind transcend personal and cultural differences to reveal the essential similarity of the phenomena concerned. The signs and symptoms usually described, such as alterations in emotions and thought processes, visions and voices, appear to be largely personally determined. But the sensations such as itching, fluttering, tingling, heat and cold, perceptions of inner lights and sounds, and the occurrence of contortions and spasms appear to be quite universal. It is this universality that leads us to postulate that all spiritual practices are activating the same basic process, and that this process has a definite physiological basis that gives rise to these specific bodily symptoms. On the other hand, the emotional correlates of this process are also important. It is these and the changed thinking that accompanies them that result in this process frequently being mistaken for mental illness. It is also these aspects that ultimately provide the personal meaning of the transformation for the people who experience it. We realize that we cannot present in all their rich experiential detail the broad spectrum of personal experiences these people have undergone, the intricacies of their feeling and thought processes, their ecstasies and their desperate confusions. The compelling quality of these experiences overshadow the physiological details, so that the person tends to ignore subtle changes in his or her physical state. These vary so widely that it seems as if they have nothing in common. This is why we will limit ourselves to a focus on the physiological parameters that we can relate to Bentov's model. Chapter 3. Kundalini as a model for the rebirth process. Every spiritual tradition that is concerned with the rebirth process has its own model. Most of these are descriptions that stress the subjective side of the experience, either treating the objective signs as incidental or ignoring them. Thus, these accounts, however valid they may be on their own terms, are not helpful in making objective comparisons of different traditions. When it comes to physiological interpretations, most of these models have little relevance. An exception is the Kundalini model from yoga. Kundalini is seen as an energy that usually resides asleep at the base of the spine. When this energy is awakened, it rises slowly up the spinal canal to the top of the head. This may mark the beginning of a process of enlightenment. In its rise, Kundalini causes the central nervous system to throw off stress. The stress points will usually cause pain during meditation. When Kundalini encounters these stress points or blocks, it begins to act on its own volition. engaging in a self-directed, self-limited process of spreading out through the entire physio-psychological system to remove these blocks. Once a block is removed, Kundalini flows freely through that point and continues its upward journey until the next stress area is encountered. Further, the Kundalini energy diffuses in this journey so that it may be operating on several levels at once, removing several different blocks. When the course is completed, the energy all becomes focused again at the top of the head. The difference between this final state and the initial state is not simply that Kundalini is focused in a different place, but that in the meantime it has passed through every part of the organism, removing blocks and awakening consciousness there. Thus, the entire process of Kundalini action can be seen as one of purification or balancing. Just as an electric current produces light when it passes through a thin tungsten filament, but not when it passes through a thick copper wire, because the filament offers appreciable resistance while the wire does not. So also does the Kundalini cause the most sensation when it enters an area of mind or body that is blocked. But the heat generated by the friction of Kundalini against this resistance soon burns out the block, and then the sensation ceases. Similarly, just as an intense flow of water through a small rubber hose will cause the hose to whip about violently, while the same flow through a fire hose would scarcely be noticed, so also does the flow of Kundalini through obstructed channels within the body or mind cause motions of those areas until the obstructions have been washed out and the channels widened. The term channel, widen, blocks, and so on must be taken metaphorically. They may not refer to actual physical structures, dimensions, and processes, but are only useful analogies for understanding this model of Kundalini action. The actual process is undoubtedly much more subtle and complex. The spontaneous movements, shifting body sensations, and other phenomena reported in our cross-cultural survey and in our own cases can easily be interpreted as manifestations of Kundalini action. Furthermore, Bentov has recently proposed a physiological model for Kundalini that accounts for much of what we have reported and observed. His study is evaluated in terms of our results later. Because of the objective orientation of his Kundalini model, its universal applicability, and its susceptibility to physiological interpretation, we shall adopt it as the basis for our discussions. However, there are differences between our own observations and the classical Kundalini concept. Most notably, we observe, and several traditions report, that the energy or sensation rises up the feet and legs, the body, back and spine to the head, but then passes down over the face and through the throat, finally terminating in the abdomen. This is entirely in accord with predictions from Bentov's model, but somewhat at variance with the reports of Muktananda, Gopi Krishna, and classical yoga scriptures. Therefore, we propose the term physio-Kundalini to refer to those aspects of Kundalini awakening, both physiological and psychological, which can be accounted for by a purely physiological mechanism. We shall refer to the physio-Kundalini process, the physio-Kundalini cycle, the physio-Kundalini mechanism, and the physio-Kundalini complex. Bentov's model describes such physiological changes that require no supernormal forces. The slow progression of energy sensation up through the body, then down the throat, accompanied by a variety of movements, sensations, and mental disturbances that terminate when this traveling stimulus reaches its culmination in the abdomen, is so characteristic that we should call it the physio-Kundalini cycle. When the energy encounters a resistance, then overcomes it and purifies the system of that block, we shall say that the location of that block has been opened. The throat opening is one typical example. This gives us a terminology linked to the Kundalini concept, suited to the level of our observations and amenable to physiological interpretation. At the same time, it preserves the full integrity of the classical meaning of Kundalini without committing us to a belief that this mystical concept is accurate or corresponds to anything objectively real.